Hello, friends, and welcome to the April 27th edition of Weekly Witness, Texas Impact's weekly opportunity for mainstream Texans of faith to learn about policy issues here in our great state and have a conversation about how you can engage in that process. My name is Scott Braddock, your host and Texas Impact's Director of Public Witness, and we have an exciting election season episode for you today as we welcome Scott Braddock to the program. Scott is the editor of Quorum Report and quorumreport.com, and one of the most well-respected and well-connected members of the Austin media. He joins us to talk about the Texas political landscape in the upcoming primary runoff elections. And since it is election season, we'll be joined by friend of the program, Grace Chimene, president of the League of Women Voters of Texas, to discuss the two elections taking place in May. On this week's Watchlist, Josh talks to us about what he's watching in the lead-off to the primary runoffs. And to kick us off, we'll begin with a weekly word from our friend and neighbor, Usama Malik, from just across the street at Austin Presbyterian Theological Seminary. But before we get to the program, I want to share a couple of quick thoughts at the top. First, thanks as always to all who've reached out with comments, questions, and suggestions for the podcast. We'd love to hear from you. I'll be looking for your emails at scott@texasimpact.org. And help us out by subscribing, sharing, and inviting a friend to listen. We're talking in this episode about not one, but two upcoming elections. Early voting's underway for the May 7th elections and opens up again May 16th for the May 24th primary runoff elections. I haven't heard many people talking about these elections, which is not surprising because turnout for May elections are typically terrible, but the results will have very real consequences for public policy in Texas. So, as people of faith who are paying attention to a podcast like this, that means it is even more important that we put in the work in the next few weeks to make sure that our friends study the issues and make a plan to vote. We don't want to leave the decisions in the hands of a small minority of partisans to make decisions for all of Texas. Your vote might count 5 to 10 times more in this election than in November. So listen to the episode, share it, make a plan, and vote. So with that, here we go. The Weekly Word with Usama Malik.
Assalamu alaikum, peace and blessings be upon you. My name is Usama Malik, and I'm a lifelong resident of Central Texas here in Austin, and the resident chaplain at Muslim Space, as well as a chaplain to Travis State Jail and the Williamson County Jail and to Trinity University in San Antonio, Texas. So currently, Muslims are observing the final 10 days and nights of the sacred month of Ramadan, a month that people often associate with fasting, but is in fact so much more. The Quran instructs Muslims that fasting has been prescribed for them, as it was prescribed to those who came before them, that they may become more God-conscious, that they may become more aware of God, not that they may just simply lose weight or abstain from food and water simply for the sake of standing out or dieting. It is interesting to note that on the topic of civic engagement and being active participants in the welfare of our communities, the Quran lifts up to its readers: help one another and cooperate together in matters, initiatives, and actions of virtue, righteousness, and piety, but do not help one another nor cooperate together in sin, transgression, and harm, and be mindful and aware of God. This very same aspect of being aware of God, being mindful of God, not just with respect to a personal ritual or faith observance, but to those matters which also concern public welfare and the world outside of one's own personal sphere. We understand intentional civic participation and engagement to be a form of justice in its essence, when used for that which does not harm, marginalize, or oppress anyone. However, there are times where this participation or engagement can be utilized as a tool for injustice as well, when used to target the needy, the marginalized, the homeless, in shackling the asylum seekers, or in the destruction of homes, lands, and bodies of others, and in which its abstention then is needed, yet the obligation to find alternatives to continue to do the work towards justice does not cease. Civic engagement and involvement in Islam goes well beyond the confines of a ballot box or a vote. It is a divine injunction. Islam lifts up an ethic, not just applicable to Muslims, but to all who may come across its message, to be a people be vanguards of justice. The Quran states, O ye who believe, stand out firmly for and be upholders of justice, as witnesses for God, even if it be against yourselves, or your parents, or your family, whether they be rich or poor. And in a later chapter, O ye who believe, stand out firmly for God, and be just witnesses. Be just witnesses, and let not the enmity, hatred, and hurt of others make you avoid justice. Be just, for that is nearer to piety and righteousness, and be mindful and aware of God. Verily God is well acquainted and aware with what you do. Again, we see this concept of being mindful, being aware of God, a clarion call to those who hear these words to not just be mindful of God in our own private matters and lives, but to also do so in the public sphere, and to be people who are not just outwardly upholding one ethic and virtue signaling while inwardly practicing another, but to be people of balance and of justice in not just the world around us, but just as much within our own homes and our own lives. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, teaches us concerning our obligation towards justice that our actions speak not only louder than words, but louder than our closeted laments, our social media solidarity, and our anger which remains within us, yet never is used towards doing anything productive, saying, Whosoever amongst you sees an evil, let them change it with their hands, and if they are not able to, then with their tongue. And if they are not able to do that, then let them hate it in their hearts, and that is the weakest of faith. Lastly, beyond a personal obligation and injunction to be an upholder of justice, Islam reminds us that we do not live in vacuums, whether we be Muslims, Christians, Jews, or people of all other faiths or of no faith at all. And we have an obligation and a duty towards one another, especially as neighbors and residents of a similar land. The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, states that one is not a believer whose neighbor is not safe from them, and that a person is not a believer who goes to sleep with their needs satisfied, satiated, while their neighbor goes to sleep hungry, deprived, and in need. The Quran tells us that we were created by God in different tribes, different nations, different peoples, for the purpose that we may come to know one another, and that in God's eyes, the most honored, dignified, and noble of us are those who are most mindful and aware of God. Civic engagement requires we be aware of ourselves, that we be aware of our neighbors and our communities and their needs and afflictions. Faith requires that we do so as well while being aware of God, for God is ever aware of that which we do. Thank you.
This week's episode was brought to you by Methodist Healthcare Ministries of South Texas, Friendship West Baptist Church in Dallas, and the COVID Collaborative.
Joining us for today's conversation is Weekly Witness favorite, Scott Braddock, who is the editor of Quorum Report and quorumreport.com. And I will say, Scott, there are so many times during the legislative session where we have rapid response members or members of ours email us and ask questions based on an email that you just sent out. And so I know a lot of our folks are taking advantage of it, and we love having you on the programs. Thanks for the time.
Well, I'm here to create more work for you.
That it does often tend to work out that way. So we appreciate it. But I will say, like, Text Impact Team, myself included, get a lot of information for you. So really appreciate that, and hope folks will check out the website. So it is primary runoff time. And when we talked about setting up this program, we really thought we would be diving into the primary runoffs that are coming up end of the month. But there's a lot of news from people who are not on the ballot in May, people who've already won their primary election races. So the lieutenant governor and governor have both been making a lot of news over the course of the last few weeks. What are you seeing and hearing from those state leaders that folks should be aware of?
With the governor, it's almost like he's still running a primary. As you said, he got through it, and he won it handily against three challengers. Governor Abbott, I think, finished with 66% against three people, and he is still adopting some of the positions that his opponents in the primary were pushing. You might remember that former State Senator Don Huffines had said on WFAA television in Dallas that he would, if he was governor, he would shut down border crossings out of Mexico even if it meant economic damage to Texas. And Governor Abbott has gone ahead and done that here in the past couple of weeks.
Right.
Over the Easter break, we had folks with not enough produce in the stores because of what the governor had done, increasing inspections of commercial vehicles coming across the bridges from Mexico. And this is not without economic consequence for Texas. I think it was more than $400 million per day that we saw, as an economic cost, about $4 billion GDP loss for Texas over the course of a couple of weeks as Governor Abbott did this. And he was, really trying to show that he's tough on the border, tough on immigration. Border security, immigration, that is the issue if we put those two together. And you can argue that they're inextricably linked, but they're also, two issues that have their own distinct character, right? When we talk about what goes on with those who are seeking asylum, those who are coming here just for jobs, versus border security itself. And both are important. But I think it all gets lumped together. And of course, that as one issue is the thing that most inflames the Republican base, the base of the party has been excited about the issue for at least 15, if not 20 years. I mean, this all goes back to, you remember when former president and former governor George W. Bush, when he was in the White House in 2007 heading into 2008, he had pushed for immigration reform that would have been a comprehensive package, and he faced a revolt within his own party over that, right? He was pushing for a path to citizenship for undocumented folks. And of course, think about the change in tone over the years of the Republican Party going back to that time when the standard bearer would have said and did say that family values don't end at the Rio Grande. That these folks, that we're all part of one sort of North American community, and that we need to have an immigration policy that makes sense. Think about that to what we have now, where the Republican Party line is that we need to shut down the border and we need to make sure that nobody's coming in here. And think about the fact that what Abbott and Lieutenant Governor Dianne Patrick, that our AG Ken Paxton, and Senator Ted Cruz and others, think about what they are asking to be kept in place. This Title 42 restriction that was put in place by the Trump administration, it allows for the ejection of migrants due to COVID concerns. It's a COVID restriction. Is it the only COVID restriction that they're in favor of?
I think so.
Every other COVID restriction needs to go away, right? According to these same folks, no masks, no social distancing, and I get it. It's a dynamic situation. People have their vaccines, and a lot of people want to move on from that. But it's interesting that for Abbott, that's the COVID restriction that needs to be in place, the one that would keep undocumented folks out of this country, or people who are seeking asylum out of this country. So in a lot of ways, you kind of can draw the conclusion, and I don't make predictions, this about me, but you can sort of draw the conclusion that Abbott is maybe eyeing something else other than the governorship, right? That maybe he's starting to think about higher office. Maybe he's thinking, and when you're governor of Texas, the next one up is, it's not U.S. Senator, it's President of the United States, right? And so who would he be competing against for that? It'd be Ron DeSantis in Florida, who, of course, is also, one of the leaders of the culture wars now in the United States. And when former President Trump first won the White House in that 2016 campaign, you think about the kind of message he was using at that time. And a lot of it had to do with economics. A lot of it had to do with, if he talked about immigration, a lot of the subtext there was that if immigrants are coming into this country, they're taking jobs from you, right? And he was making a big appeal to people in the Midwest, people in those Rust Belt states where they have seen, their manufacturing jobs go away. And Trump was able to flip some of those traditionally Democratic states that had been blue states to red states, places like, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin. You look at these places that previously Republicans just couldn't even compete. Well, if you think about the fact that Secretary Clinton did better in Texas and Joe Biden did better in Texas than previous Democratic nominees for president, what Trump was doing was trading votes here for votes up there. Right. He was losing some folks here to pick up votes up there. For Republicans' sake, it's good for them that they have such an advantage in Texas that it didn't matter, right, that they would still win in Texas. And so, you think about those issues, those economic issues, intertwined with immigration. That's what, really delivered a victory for Trump. But what led to a Trump downfall and what may put Republicans in bad position, including Governor Abbott, to try to win the White House, to try to win it back, is that it's really shifted from an economic message. I mean, in the border shutdown that we just saw, there was, just a calamitous situation for the economy. If that was to continue, that would not be sustainable, right? I mean, at the losses that we were taking for those 2 weeks. Now the message is more about traditional culture war issues, right? And you think about the kinds of things that are in the headlines now from both Governor Abbott, Lieutenant Governor Patrick, AG Paxton. What are the things they're talking about? Critical race theory and banning that in our schools, which of course they passed 2 bills on that. It wasn't good enough to ban it once; they had to ban it twice. In the Texas legislature, constitutional carry of firearms. That's carrying handguns with no license. A 6-week abortion ban. Go down the list of anti-LGBT and transgender legislation. All of that stuff is really designed to appeal to the supporters of former President Trump, who, if you think about who those people are, especially in changing communities, places like Plano, Collin County, Denton and Denton County, Fort Bend County, our suburban communities, Williamson County, Hayes County. A lot of these folks are the non-college educated white guy who looks around their community that is rapidly diversifying and they don't like it, right? And so if you are a Republican, it's an effective playbook for you with them to say that, hey, guess what? We're going to be your bulwark against that. We'll be your bulwark against a changing America. And you see that in all of these issues that have been embraced by today's Republican Party, including our state leaders in Texas.
Let's talk about that a little bit, because we are, our listeners are Texans of faith, and we've taken theological positions on a lot of the issues that you just talked about. Mm-hmm. And so, we could have a theological discussion about that for a long, long time. But in the Texas legislature, for the longest time, the motto has been what's good for business is good for Texas. And that doesn't necessarily seem to be the case right now. And you're seeing similar things play out in Texas. So how has that changed, and what might the results be in terms of impact on the business community?
It's the right question. It's interesting that I think that we haven't quite gotten to a point where the Texas legislature is anti-business, although you could say that the move we were talking about from Governor Abbott was certainly against the interests of business when it comes to the immigration and border security issue. On that issue, there's always been sort of a balance to be had, right? Because you can do so much on border security before you start to, you can only do so much on it before you start to impact, cross-border commerce. But in the Texas legislature, it seems like they're not so much anti-business as they are maybe ignoring business needs and not really making it the thing that's on the front burner. So here's a good example. That there was sort of a right-left coalition to do away with what we call the Chapter 313 agreements, the big tax incentive agreements. And, you had groups as diverse as, on the left, Every Texan, which of course used to be called the Center for Public Policy Priorities, and the Texas Public Policy Foundation on the right, both against those tax incentives, which basically, create a big property tax break when there's a corporate relocation so that, the schools are made whole by the state, because, of course, the biggest chunk of the property tax bill is the ISD in your area. And so if they can save money for these companies when they come in, then they will do that, and they try to do it in a way that's neutral, revenue neutral for the schools, which, like, the schools don't really. If you think about who wants to see big corporate relocations, who are the people who show up for the ribbon cutting for one of these things, for the groundbreaking? It'd be the governor, it'd be the lieutenant governor, it'd be the mayor in the city, it would be the county judge and commissioners and city council members and people like that. You might have some involvement from the school district, but they don't really care about that as much. They're just there to educate the kids, right? The school districts are not there for quote unquote economic development projects, right? So their deal has always been that they don't really care about this stuff as long as their revenue stays neutral, which is why we had that's why we had the Chapter 313 agreements. Well, in the Texas House, they prioritized renewal of that program, and they actually passed 2 bills in the House. One that would have kept the program just about like it is, and I think that was carried by Chairman Morgan Meyer in the Ways and Means Committee. And the other bill carried by Representative Jim Murphy, if I remember right, was one that would have expanded the program and done more for these sorts of economic agreements, tax incentive agreements. And the fact is that it just died in the Texas Senate. And in a lot of ways, based on everything I heard about that, it wasn't so much that the lieutenant governor was against the Chapter 313 agreements. I think that he still considers himself pretty pro-business, but he was prioritizing these culture war issues. Everything that I heard was that he was more, at the time that the tax incentive agreement legislation was dying in the Senate, he was more concerned about the fact that the Texas House had not yet held a hearing on his Star-Spangled Banner Act. You remember this? The lieutenant governor wanted to, and he did, they passed a bill that said that if events receive tax dollars, then they have to perform the Star-Spangled Banner at the beginning of the event. And this was born out of a fight, about a 24-hour fight with Mark Cuban, the owner of the Dallas Mavericks, who for a little while was not having the Star-Spangled Banner performed at the beginning of their NBA games in Dallas. And it was really a nothing burger story anyway. About 6 months after it happened, you would have to tell people what happened because they had forgotten about it. Because, Scott, you may remember that as soon as it was reported that the Mavericks were not doing the Star-Spangled Banner at the beginning of the games, well, Mark Cuban just said, okay, well, we'll just go back and do it again if it's, if people aren't happy about it. So it wasn't like anybody really had to fight with him about it. But it's the kind of thing where the lieutenant governor is more concerned with the voters who show up in a Republican primary. He's more concerned about them and appeasing them, giving them things that they want, more concerned about that than anything else. And at this point, to the exclusion of what might be good for business. I mean, to your point and to your question, are they sort of turning a corner on being pro-business? It's always been that, and by the way, we should say, when Democrats were in charge in Texas, it was pretty pro-business, right? I mean, this has always been a pro-business state, whether it was the Democrats or the Republicans, probably even more so as Republicans came in to power, and more so when former Governor Perry was there, and he was the one who really pushed for those economic agreements, those tax incentives. If you go back to 2001, the session when the Chapter 313 agreements were adopted, it was first championed by the mayor of Fort Worth. I think they were looking at, if I remember right, they were looking at bringing Intel into Fort Worth. They were going to build a big chip plant there, and I think that the project never happened. But the push was from local governments to be able to try to get these sorts of deals done in their towns because it's good for the economy, it's good for jobs, and that's the kind of thing that, at the time, Governor Perry and the Lieutenant Governor, Bill Ratliff, were all in favor of, in the Texas Senate. And now you can't even get a bill on that through the Senate. So there definitely is a shift on these things that are quote unquote good for business, and whether or not Republicans are prioritizing those things. I think some Republicans are, but not all of them.
You mentioned the primary elections coming up in a couple of weeks, and there are certainly some high-profile ones and some legislative races that I think will shape decisions that the Texas legislature will be making next year. So what are you seeing in those races? What are the dividing lines, and how might they impact the next Texas legislature?
I think for the most part, we're kind of settled out for what the legislature is going to look like. But you're right, there are some races that do matter in the runoffs. I think that folks are keeping a close eye. Folks in Austin keeping a close eye on the runoff for Stephanie Click, who's the chair of public health. The runoff for Glenn Rogers, who's a pro-public education Republican from Eastland, from that area. And you look at the dividing lines. It's interesting. Governor Abbott, who has been sort of, this is the way some people put it, the nice way to put it, he's been threading the needle on the issue of, quote, school choice and school vouchers. And he hasn't really said exactly where he is on that. He goes out of his way to not exactly say where he is on that. You might remember earlier this year, he unveiled something that he was calling a parental Bill of Rights, that he would like to have the legislature pass some sort of a bill on that coming up in 2023. But it was sort of vague, very insufficiently detailed about school choice, just that he is in favor of some form of school choice. In the past, before that, he had said that any school choice legislation that gets to his desk, he'll sign it, right? And he says that fully knowing that a school voucher program is probably dead on arrival in the Texas House of Representatives. And as you may remember, the battles to try to get a school choice or a school voucher bill through the Texas Senate is still a battle. Right. I mean, it doesn't just pass instantly. It may now, coming up in 23, given the new composition of the Senate, because we see some more folks who are right in line with Lieutenant Governor Patrick, who are going to be coming in as new senators. And we'll have a whole crop of new senators, and of course a new crop of state reps as well. We've had a lot of retirements. It is a redistricting year. When the districts change, often it's not people who listen to this show probably know that it's not that unusual that once you get through a redistricting session and the political boundaries are different, you'll have a lot of retirements and a lot of new faces. So we will see that at the Texas Capitol. But it's still hard to imagine that you would have a school voucher bill, a full-on school voucher bill pass in the Texas legislature. But we'll watch some of these races to see if there's any different sort of mood. I mean, the Glenn Rogers race is a good, indicator maybe, because it is one of those areas where you do have, a lot of rural Texas weighing in on this. And rural Texas, it just doesn't benefit from school vouchers at all. The people who live in those places, I think that, for the most part, when they hear somebody like Senator Ted Cruz championing school choice, championing school vouchers, they tend to think of it in terms of how that would work in communities other than their community. They think about the way it gets talked about is, this would be something that would be beneficial to, a young, low-income person, maybe in the inner city, maybe in parts of suburban Texas. It doesn't get talked about as much for their areas. And if you had a pie graph of all the different, factions of different people as far as where they are on quote unquote school choice and why they might be against it or for it, you could imagine a large chunk of the pie graph would just be the folks who are in favor of traditional public education. People who would argue that, hey, if you have a school voucher program, then it's going to drain resources from traditional public schools. That would be a lot of Republicans, probably at least half of them in the Texas House. Probably almost every Democrat would agree with that. If you start to look at who some of the others are, charter schools, the folks who run charter schools and the folks who are in favor of charter schools, in some ways they realize that a voucher program would be competition for what they do. So they're not thrilled with the idea either. You do have people who are, pro-private school. I've got a friend who serves on the board of what he would call a right-wing private school here in Texas. And he has said, look, he is not in favor of a school voucher program at all. And the reason that they don't want that is because if there are government dollars flowing to these private institutions, at some point they fear that the government would start to tell them what they can teach and what they can't teach to the kids. On that pie graph, the smallest sliver, the smallest piece of pie would be people who think that you should use tax dollars to teach the Bible to children. There are some who think that. I think Tim Dunn, who's the biggest bankroller of Empower Texans and some of those organizations, he's somebody who I think probably does agree with that, but it's not many. And so you still have the governor, I think, in some ways looking maybe down the road toward a look for a run for the presidency, in a presidential primary nationally. Where you stand on school choice is sort of a litmus test. It's the kind of thing that Ted Cruz and Ron DeSantis would have. They'd have no problem saying that, yes, they're for school choice. And in these runoffs in the Texas House, you have Cruz, who is supporting candidates like the challenger to Glenn Rogers, who is pro-voucher. And interestingly, Governor Abbott has been making endorsements that are of people like Glenn Rogers, who's pro-public education. So there does seem to be a dividing line there. Other thing we should mention, of course, is the race for Attorney General is still not settled out. You have a runoff between the scion of the Bush dynasty. He probably wouldn't like me saying that, but George P. Bush. It's hard to get away from being George Bush when your name is George Bush, right?
Can't hide that.
And Ken Paxton, of course, the sitting Attorney General. There just doesn't seem to be any energy for the challenge to Paxton in the form, as embodied by George P. Bush. I think that they did have a spirited first round in that race with three challengers, including a former Supreme Court justice and the retiring Congressman Louis Gohmert. But now that we're in the runoff, it's interesting. Usually, when you have an incumbent in a runoff, that's the last place they want to be. That's awful. It means just by the math that you're somebody who the voters are familiar with as the incumbent, and more than half of the voters didn't want you. But in this instance, you have it's sort of the script is flipped, because you have Ken Paxton, who has the support of former President Trump. He has the support of some of the truest of believers, in the Republican Party. And by that, I mean the folks who fully embrace the culture war issues that I was talking about. And one of the other things that has become, I think, culture war-ish, if you will, is the fight over quote-unquote election integrity, where you have a lot of Republicans who still, even in the face of no evidence, still believe that the 2020 election was stolen from President Trump. And in Ken Paxton, you have the Attorney General, the only one in the whole country, who would take the lead and sue other states to try to overturn their election results. And of course, you can only imagine what would happen if some Democratic Attorney General from some other state tried to sue Texas over what we had done in our elections. Probably wouldn't go over very well, but you wouldn't see Democrats doing that. This has become, for some of, not all Republicans, but for some Republicans, sort of a litmus test. Do you believe that President Trump was robbed in 2020? And Ken Paxton is the poster boy for the folks who think that he got robbed. And so I could imagine that he will beat Commissioner Bush. It could be as bad for Bush as 70-30.
All right. We will we'll check back on that in a couple weeks. We do have Grace from the League of Women Voters joining us next. I just want to give you a chance. Any closing thoughts or words you'd like to say to folks as we move into election season?
I just think that more participation is always good. I've started to say this, Scott, and it sounds maybe a little hyperbolic, but I don't think so. I think that the Republican primary in Texas is the most important election on earth that no one pays attention to.
Right.
What I mean by that, and it should be obvious to any of the folks who listen to the show and to yourself, that here you have an election that almost no one participates in, right? I mean, we're doing really well in Texas, a state of 30 million people. We're doing really well if 1.5 or 2 million people participate in that election. And I mean, that's the high water mark, right, for what you might see. The turnout is abysmal. It's very low.
Yes.
And so you have, as few as 500,000 to 750,000 people who, if they make up the majority, who are supporting, a certain Republican candidate in the primary, they're making the decisions that will directly impact the policy prescriptions that 30 million Americans live with, right? The legislature and state government will fall in line with what those voters want, and that's the way the democracy works. And if you have more people participating in that, you have a chance to influence that outcome, right? To move it in a certain direction. And I think that folks get caught up in the narrative of whether Texas will turn blue. You see these national stories every 2 and 4 years about this is the year, right, that Democrats are going to win in Texas. And I'm not saying that it can't happen, and I'll be happy to cover competitive elections in November if that's what we end up with, or we did have that, back in 2018. And I think it's good for the policy outcomes at the Capitol. Remember, we had a competitive election in 2018, and 2019 was focused on bread and butter issues that all Texans care about. But then you had another blowout for Republicans in 2020. At least that's the way they perceived it. The Republicans held on to the majorities in the Texas House and Senate and kept all of course they keep all the statewide seats as well, even though most of them are not on the ballot in 2020. But the fact is that at that point, it all reverted to the primary. And giving the primary voters the things that they want. And that's why you end up with, a list of what some folks would just call a red meat festival at the Texas Capitol. All these issues that we've been talking about, the CRT bans, the constitutional carry, the 6-week abortion ban, anti-transgender children legislation, and all of that stuff is all designed to give these Republican office holders sort of a suit of armor in their Republican primary so that their challenger really has no argument against them. For the most part, that seemed to work. I think one thing to keep an eye on is whether or not the speaker, Dade Phelan, who we haven't mentioned yet, one thing to keep an eye on is whether he really, now that he's had a pretty good primary season, his incumbents for the most part were able to keep their seats. He did a lot of money. I think all told something like $2 million from the speaker spent in the primaries to try to protect his incumbents. Now that he's had that kind of success, I wonder if he sort of gets his legs under him and he's not really a rookie anymore, and he becomes a little more independent in dealing with the whims of the governor and the lieutenant governor, because the speaker, he's elected in his own district, but he's also got 149 other voters who are looking for him, the members of the House, looking for him to kind of take the slings and arrows when sometimes they can't be seen doing that. So we'll see, whether he does develop more of an independent streak or continues to just give the governor whatever he wants.
Scott Braddock, really appreciate the time today. I usually ask folks for a shameless plug, or if they have any, but I'll let you add to it. But I'll just suggest to folks Quorum Report, quorumreport.com, and Scott is an entertaining and informative follow on Twitter, so make sure you're doing that. Anything else you have for us in closing today?
I think you covered it all. We covered the waterfront, Scott. Thank you.
You're amazing. Appreciate the time today. Thanks for all you do. Joining us for today's weekly watch list is Texas Impact's Advocacy Director, Joshua Houston. Hello, Josh. It's good seeing you.
Yeah, it's good seeing you.
I understand you have a big weekend coming up. What's going on?
Yeah, we have the Black Voters Matters having an event at the state capitol this weekend, and there will be buses and there will be speaking, and it'll be a big full work day on a Saturday.
I'm hoping that's not a shot at me, so I'm not going to be there. I think we know this because I'm going to be coaching my daughter's U16 soccer team in the state championship, and so maybe next week we'll have some soccer players on talking about that win. We'll have to see if
we'll need an update on that.
Yeah, I will give an update next week if we win. If not, just assume maybe not so much. But I don't think people tuned in to hear us talk about my coaching career. So you are watching elections this week, right?
Yeah, like everyone else in the Capitol community, I am watching the primary runoffs. And what I think a lot of people don't understand about runoffs is that issues are on the ballot, even if they're not explicitly on the ballot. They are personified by the candidates and the issues that the candidates raise in the campaign. So throughout this campaign, there are at least three big themes that keep recurring in a number of House races at the state level. Three big ones are public education, LGBTQ rights, specifically trans rights, and immigration.
I'm curious, many of these races have already been settled or will be settled in November, but there are some really big issues that are coming up, as you mentioned, themes that are playing out in these very low turnout elections, especially, for races in the Texas House. So how is what happens during these May runoffs going to impact the next Texas legislature?
Yeah, some of these down ballot races. So at a statewide level, as few as 3% of the state's voting age population can influence a statewide runoff in a state of 30 million people. Just 3% of them participating can have a huge outsized influence. When you get down ballot to a House race, one of the 150 seats in the Texas House, it's even bigger. So to kind of make this point, I want to tell a story. It's an older story now, going back to 2005, which was my first legislative session.
You're getting old, Josh.
I know. I'm starting to get some seasoning on me, I think. But I remember in that 2005 session, there was a chair of a committee, the House Public Education Committee. And the chair was Representative Kent Grusendorf, who was a big proponent of privatizing the public education system through school vouchers. And then when he got to his reelection campaign in 2006, the year after that, the public education community responded, and one of the candidates that ran against him, the candidate that ran against him was a public school teacher. Her name was Dianne Patrick. And that race, as you might expect, centered on the future of public education. And this was in the Arlington area. And so when all the votes were counted, there were just under 6,000 votes for Dianne Patrick, which represented a majority of the 10,000 voters that participated in that race. And 10,000 is it's a pretty good average for what you could expect to show up in a primary runoff for a House member. And so those 6,000 voters sent a message, not just to those two candidates, but sent a message to all 150 members of the Texas House regarding especially the Republican Party in the Texas House about the future and direction that the voters wanted the state to go on policy towards public education and not privatizing the public school system. And that message has reverberated not just for one election cycle, but for the better part of a decade, in fact, more than a decade.
So what are you watching as we move into these May 24th primary runoffs?
Yeah, so 2022, going back to the present, we are once again, we're watching three things: public education, we're watching trans rights in particular, and immigration. And so with regard to public education, about every decade since Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, which was the Supreme Court decision that integrated the public schools, about once a decade, you have vouchers recycled as an idea, and not just as an idea, it's always kind of omnipresent, but to actually be a real legislative threat of passing. And so, that 2006 election I just mentioned is a bit ancient history now. You have the forces of the pandemic and the hardship that put on parents, and you add that to the culture wars regarding race and sexuality and sex in general and ethnicity, all those issues coming into play, and they are being used as another attempt to push for school vouchers. And so you have at least four races for the Texas House, and the result of those races will very much send a message to voters, send a message to legislators and elected officials about the way they think the electorate wants them to go on public education.
You also mentioned LGBTQ rights being on the ballot.
I did, and they're on the ballot in this way. So a supermajority of Texans and a supermajority of persons of faith too favor non-discrimination, and nevertheless, that's not exactly how it's playing out at the state house level. There's at least three districts where the choice is between candidates who are either campaigning enthusiastically on platforms supporting active targeting, if you will, of LGBTQ Texans with discriminatory legislation, and on the other side of the ballot, or I guess on the other side, the other candidates who have been, shall we say, less vociferously enthusiastic about discriminatory legislation. If you look at the incumbents' record, they certainly voted for discriminatory legislation, but just may not have the same priority level or enthusiasm as their opponents.
Those are some nice attorney words there. I really like that. But finally, immigration is something that's certainly been in the news and certainly something people will be watching in these elections, right?
Yeah, definitely. Over the spring, you had the former Trump administration officials, several of them, who have been pressuring border governors to, quote, declare an invasion at the southern border. And that's a legal term of art. They're invoking an obscure part of the U.S. Constitution that has never been tried in this way. So it's constitutionally dubious, but it is argued that such a declaration of invasion would allow states to claim that they have the legal authority to return migrants to Mexico. And that's at least at a minimum of what the state claims, the state would claim its authority to be. And that, of course, is a federal thing. Foreign policy and immigration is a federal issue. Nevertheless, that did not stop the Arizona Attorney General from issuing a written opinion backing the Trump administration reading that they are pushing. And a Texas House Committee chair has requested a similar opinion from the Texas Attorney General within the last couple of weeks. So accordingly, the groups that are out there, the third-party groups that back more extreme candidates in a primary, have injected this into the primary runoffs. They have sent out a questionnaire to this effect to see whether House candidates support declaration of invasion, and they are publishing candidates' responses, and those responses are illuminating.
This is just a reminder to our listeners. We're talking about things that we're going to be watching, and we'll be talking about it again after these May 24th elections. But this isn't just something for us to be watching. We should also be participating. Josh reminded us, Scott Braddock reminded us, these are very low turnout elections. And so now's the time to be paying attention to these races. And as somebody who listens to this podcast, you're probably more informed than most of the people in your congregation or most of the people you interact with. So I think that the homework for today is to not just watch, but participate.
Yeah, that's right, Scott. So let's put it into perspective with some real numbers. So each House district that we're talking about, right? One House district represents roughly 190,000 Texans. And if history repeats itself in May, and we have all reason to think it will, then somewhere between 4,000 and 14,000 voters will participate in a runoff for a state house seat. That's the range. The low end is 4,000. The high end is 14,000. 14,000 is kind of a high turnout race for a May runoff. What that means is as few as like 2001, if you take the low number of 4,000, 2001 is a majority. 2001 voters could send a message on May 24th that affects the policy direction that the entire 88th Texas legislature will take on public education, on LGBTQ persons, or immigration.
Josh, really appreciate the time. We'll certainly be watching with you.
Thanks, Scott.
It is election season in Texas, and so you know that we will have one of our favorite advocates for democracy join us for the program. So I'd like to welcome back Weekly Witness veteran Grace Shamane, president of the League of Women Voters of Texas. Hey, Grace, glad you could be with us.
Hey, I'm happy to be here.
It must be a really fun season for you because we have not one, but two elections in Texas in the month of May. And to be clear, they're not the same elections. So many voters are probably confused about what the difference is between these two elections and what's on the ballot. So let's take them chronologically. What exactly is on the May 7th election? Like, what are we voting on?
So normally the May elections just have local elections. So that'll be your school board, or if you're getting a new city council people, or maybe you're getting a new county person. Those school bonds sometimes are on the election. If there's any propositions in your community, those are on the elections. It's a time for local elections to happen. What's special about this election is that there's also a special constitutional amendment election going on. So there's two propositions that the legislators have put out onto your ballot that are going to be voted on in this election, too.
And we had Dick Levine on a couple of weeks ago and talked about those two constitutional amendment elections, but you also have information on your website about that as well.
Right. What we did, we thought that it was fairly complicated, and so we wanted to make it as easy as possible for voters. So we have it on Vote 411, the information about the amendments, and also like a simple explanation and some pros and cons. And we have it available on Vote 411 or as a PDF or as a video if you just want to watch somebody talk about it. So it's real easy for people to figure out how they want to vote on those particular proposed constitutional amendments.
You also mentioned school board elections. School boards have been in the news a lot lately. Why should listeners care about that? And is there anything we should know about those particular elections?
Well, whether you have children in the school district or you just live in the school district, public education has always been so important in Texas and in the United States. And recently it has become something that people are talking about more. So it's more important than ever that people are aware that there is an election going on. So most of the elections that are run by the school boards, you could find at your county election website and see if there's a school board election going on. But some school boards are having their own elections. And so you really, I'm encouraging everybody to go to their school district website and look at it and see if they're having an election, because I don't want anybody to be surprised. Most people vote with the county, but occasionally school districts have their own elections. So please check out your county school district and see if they're having an election. Sometimes it's a proposition, sometimes it's a bond, sometimes it is the school board. So whether you have somebody that you're electing or not is something that you could find out at Vote 411 or at your county election office or at your school district office.
So it is important, we were talking before we came on, it is important that you check both your county election office and the school district, right? Just to make sure, because I have noticed like a Katy ISD, and I believe it's,
There's some other school districts are having their own independent election. So you cannot, you wouldn't be able to find it on your county election website. You would have to go to vote in two different places. But these school board elections are so important to your children's public education, your grandchildren's public education, and the education of the children in your community. We encourage everybody to go vote in those elections.
And early voting is underway for the May 7th elections while we post this.
Right, absolutely. So it goes from April 25th, which was Monday, all the way through May 3rd is your opportunity to early vote. If you want to vote on election day, that would be May the 7th, Tuesday, May the 7th for that election.
After the May 7th elections, you're not done voting. You can't wait until November because there is another set of elections coming up May 24th. We know those are primary runoff elections, but what are those elections and what should we be watching for in those?
So what's really important, boy, is your vote valuable in the Texas primary runoff election because hopefully you all voted in the primary election and you either voted in the Democratic primary or in the Republican primary. And those, the folks that did not get over 50% of the votes, the top two go on and are in a runoff election. So what I want you to know is that if you voted in the Democratic primary during the primary, then you need to vote in then we encourage you to vote in the Democratic primary runoff election. The same thing with the Republican Party. If you voted in the Republican primary, vote in the primary runoff. And if you didn't vote in the primary, then vote in whichever one you want to vote in. You're welcome to, and encourage all your friends and family to vote because few people vote in it. And when that happens, we have a very few running in the election in November and perhaps leading an important office for whatever office it is. So let's go through some of those offices. Ready?
Ready. Let's hear it.
So in the Democratic Party, I was looking through, and it looks like we have a runoff election for lieutenant governor, attorney general, the comptroller. And the comptroller is the one who is kind of like your accountant for Texas, and the land commissioner. And we have some runoff in the State Board of Education also. So it's really important that the Democratic people who are going to vote in the Democratic primary runoff get out there, review who those folks are who are in a runoff and choose the best one that they want to have run in the general election in November. In the Republican Party, there's also some very important elected officials that are candidates are going to be elected. And that's the attorney general. That's a real big one. So please, we would hope all our Republican voters get out there and vote in the primary runoff for the attorney general, for the railroad commissioner, which many folks on this call know that is all about oil and gas, not really about railroads. And they also have some certain State Board of Education also have some districts that are having runoff too. So important elections out there. You might also have some local like legislators who are in a runoff election. So be sure and get out there and vote.
Yeah, it's really important to vote in these primary election runoffs, especially for those, state house races, and maybe you have some local county races, because not very many people are going to be voting in these, and they're going to send some pretty big messages that other members are going to be paying attention to as we move towards the general election and the next legislative session. So it's really important to check your ballots on those.
I was talking to somebody, I was an elected official, and he was bragging about how he got elected into office and, with a landslide or whatever. But I reminded him, I said, really, you were in a runoff election and only 3.6% of the voters voted. And only half of that voted in your particular party. So really, it was 1.6% of the people were voting, chose for him to be in the general election. So I'm not saying who it is. I'm just saying how important it is for everybody to know that we have open elections in Texas, open primaries in Texas, That means you are not registered with a particular party when you register to vote. You kind of register when you vote in the primary. So please get out there, vote in the primary, and then vote, stick with that same party when you vote in the primary runoff.
And again, just as a reminder, because I think we talk about this every time we come on, you can vote in whichever primary you want. Now, in the runoff, like you said, you have to vote in the same party as you voted in March. But if you didn't vote, you can pick whichever one you want to vote in. That doesn't mean you're locked in to vote for that candidate again in November. Right?
No. This is just a practice run. You can choose whoever you want to in the November election. Who knows what's going to happen between now and then?
So there were a lot of people who voted in, or a lot of our listeners. I'm assuming all of our listeners voted in the March primaries, but there might have been a few. We should talk later. But if any of these folks had any types of concerns voting in the primary, like with mail-in ballots getting rejected or problems with their voter registration, should we assume that those problems are probably fixed by now? Or what should voters know to make sure that they can vote and that their vote counts this time?
So the voters who mostly had the problems during the primary election were, I believe there were 25,000 vote by mail ballots rejected in the primary election. And that meant that those voters' votes didn't count. So we don't want that to happen. So if you vote by mail, you may have two different ballots, one for the local election and one for the primary runoff. Make sure those ballots go into the right envelope. When you are filling out that carrier envelope, or the last envelope you put your ballot into, open it up, open the envelope flap and look under that flap, because under the flap you have to put in your ID information, and we really encourage you to put your contact information. Please include both your driver's license number or personal ID number and the last four of your Social Security ID number. Those numbers are required, and if they're not there, then your ballot will be rejected. Then close the envelope and sign on top of that envelope flap. So it's open the envelope flap, look underneath it, fill in the ID and contact information, close the envelope flap, and sign your name. So those two things will help. Put a stamp on it, put it in the mail, and get it in as soon as you can so that they have plenty of time if there's any problems with your ballot.
Thank you. That is certainly helpful. Make sure you're sharing this information with all of your friends who plan on voting by mail or voting, just to make sure we've all got the same information. Grace, the League of Women Voters is obviously a key resource in helping people prepare for all of these elections. So walk us through what resources you'll have for each of these elections and where people should go for more information.
So if you go to vote411.org, that is where you'll be able to put in your address, and you will find the pros and cons for the constitutional amendments. And if you have a local league in your community, you will have local elections information. So that is a great resource, vote411.org. Another place you might want to go is lwvtexas.org, because we have the videos of the constitutional amendments. And I don't know, I get tired of reading, so I like to listen to somebody chat with me. So go and look at those videos. We also have more information about voting by mail. We have videos and graphics to help explain step by step how to get through that process. So we're here to help you make sure your vote is counted. If all of that doesn't work, then we're part of the Election Protection Coalition, and we want you to give Election Protection a call if there's a problem.
And so for the next week or two, the focus will be on that May 7th election, but sometime after that one wraps up, you'll have similar resources for the primary runoffs, right?
Absolutely. You'll be able to compare the candidates on your ballot. So you'll be able to choose the best candidate either on the Democratic ballot or on the Republican ballot. So that you get a good choice in the general election in November. So everybody get out there and make sure your vote's counted.
I was gonna give you an opportunity, Grace, because I think a couple weeks ago when you were on, I said you're my favorite cheerleader for democracy, and I wonder if you just have a motivational word to send us out with today.
I'm going to tell you what our mission is, because I want more leagues in all communities all across Texas. So our mission is empowering voters and defending democracy. And I cannot say that without going, woo! Yay!
Right?
Because
Yay.
it is such a great mission. And who wouldn't want to be a part of that? So if you're interested, help start a league, join the league, or support the league, or get a league started in your community, because we're getting some new ones out there and in rural communities. So I'm super excited about it.
Excellent. Well, Grace, thank you so much for the time today. And we hope everybody will take advantage of these resources and consider joining a league or starting a league in their area. Thanks for the work you do, and yay voting.
Yay voting. Thank you. Bye-bye.
I want to thank our guests today, Usama Malik, Scott Braddock, Josh Houston, and Grace Chimene. But I especially want to thank you for tuning in. Elections are coming. One of our guests a few weeks ago said that crazy people will always turn out to vote. So every sane person we can get to vote is a win. We want the electorate to truly represent the diverse voices in our communities. So make sure that you're making a plan to vote, and then invite 5 friends to join you. Your community and the world need Texans of faith engaged in this work. So I hope you'll share the important content in this episode with your friends and congregations. And with that, it's time to draw this episode to a close. If you've stayed with us this long, you must have enjoyed the content. So I hope you'll share it with your friends and congregations and leave us a rating or review. That way, even more of your friends can find us and join in the movement for justice in Texas. And y'all, there's a lot going on. So keep an eye on Texas Impact social media for upcoming announcements, or email me at scott@texasimpact.org with questions. And remember, if you appreciate Texas Impact and the Weekly Witness community, please make sure that you and your congregation are members of Texas Impact by going to texasimpact.org. Friends, these are wild times, and 2022 is an important year for democracy in our communities, and elections are a cornerstone of that work. The world needs Texans of faith active and engaged. So let's get to work.
Weekly Witness is hosted by Scott Atnet, engineered and produced by David Fasalo. Our executive producer is B. Moorhead. The opinions expressed on Weekly Witness are those of Texas Impact and our guests, and do not necessarily reflect the views of our sponsors. Weekly Witness is a product of Texas Impact, people of faith working for justice. Visit us online at texasimpact.org.